Hello. Well, I've had some nice time off over the summer, and while I was off I came to the realisation that if I was going to go this far with the engine, might as well go all the way and split the bottom end. Doing a decent job of cleaning and painting the cases would have been really challenging if I'd left it all together. Plus this way I can send the cases off for vapour blasting and really do this properly. So here we go. I've got my manual and a spare pair of underpants on standby. Let's get started. Hold those, will you? I started removing the clutch cover bolts. These will all be replaced with proper metal ones. I'd initially thought these were a gold anodizing, but it turns out they're actually made of cheese. Red Leicester, I think. A few taps with the rubber mallet and I was able to tug the cover free from the cases, with the old gasket clinging on as long as possible. I removed what was remaining of the cheese bolts and got started on the clutch. Of course, I need to keep tension on the basket to undo the bolts, so to avoid damaging anything, I slipped my pencil in between the sprocket teeth, which was enough to break the tension on the spring bolts. I worked in a crisscross pattern to release the tension as evenly as possible, and then span the bolts all the way out and remove the springs and spring seats. I thanked my pencil for the help and then removed the pressure plate. I started removing the plates. I've had no issues with the clutch while riding, but if it measures to be quite worn, it'll probably end up with new plates and springs. In order to remove the clutch centre nut, I needed to use a holding tool on the teeth of the clutch centre. With that held snug, I put a socket on the nut and gave it a go. No luck. I had to resort to the impact gun to get it free, which really isn't my preference. I took out both of the torque springs and released the clutch holding tool. So now I could remove the clutch centre, the spline spacer and the inner plate. I pulled the clutch drum out evenly until it was free from the shaft and removed it, not forgetting the needle roller bearing. With it came two sheared bolt heads that were originally holding the basket to the sprocket behind it. They could well be casualties of the impact gun. You see kids, impatience really can cost you. With the clutch off, I started to remove the alternator and oil pump drive chain, starting by removing the lower chain tensioner. I removed the remains of the damaged bolts from the sprocket and removed the upper chain guide. Removing the spacer gave the sprocket enough room to disengage from the chain, so I removed that, making sure the needle roller bearing came out with it. Next up, I removed the circlip holding the oil pump drive sprocket, which pulled off the shaft easily. Then I removed the chain completely. I removed the bolt that secures the oil feed pipe, and I removed that to give access to the circlip on the sprocket. Then I could remove that too. I loosened the 3 bolts holding the oil pump housing, which allowed me to remove the oil pump. Not forgetting the outer rotor. There's also a tiny dowel on the casing that I removed for safekeeping. So that's the clutch side disassembled, with everything laid out on the bench, ready to be put away safely for inspection later. I leant the engine backwards to get access to the sump bolts. Conveniently, this engine's got a really flat back side, unlike your mum. Sorry. I loosened the sump bolts in a star pattern, and none of them gave me any grief. A few taps of the rubber mallet was enough for the gasket to let go and start pissing oil everywhere. I pulled the oil strainer off its mount and grabbed the rubber seal, and I took out the O-ring from under the oil cooler. A gentle tug on the oil distribution pipe was enough to get that free. Then I took this little hose off. With the oil filter off, that's the underside stripped, leaving a nice flat bottom to rest it on, which means I'm now ready. I'll just take this cylinder base gasket off. I checked the manual for the correct loosening order of the crankcase bolts and got started on the upper bolts. I didn't have any issues here, other than a slight wish for an engine stand for the next time I do this. This last one had a bit of corrosion, so it gave me a bit of a fight while undoing it. I used a cardboard diagram to keep track of the bolts' locations. Then I flipped the engine to get at the bottom bolts, using a block of wood to protect the con rods. Another check of the manual for the correct order, and then I got started on the long, painful, but eventually successful journey of getting every bolt loose, albeit with some strange techniques for holding the block still. behind the cardboard. Easier from the other side now, so that is this side. Yeah. I had to remember to flip the pattern as the engine is now upside down to my diagram. The last bolts were the 9mm ones around the crankshaft. These have a tightening order cast into the block, so I started with number 10 and worked backwards. Okay. How about this, boys? We did it. As you can tell, by this point the idea of getting clear shots of the video had dropped off my list completely, so sorry about that, you'll just have to imagine what it looks like. 7. Okay. 2. 1. Right, that is all those bolts. Decent. After a moment to recover, I tapped the mating surfaces with a rubber mallet and then used a piece of wood on the pry tabs to separate the halves. There we go. You seeing that, boys? Okay. I made sure I had plenty of space around me and then lifted the bottom half off the top half, turning it round to check all the shell bearings were where they're meant to be in the journals. I know this may be just such a regular task for the pros out there, but I cannot tell you how fascinating it is to me just to look at the incredible engineering that's just sat on my workbench. The input gear cluster lifted out quite easily, so I laid that on the side. I put my block of wood back under the crankcase to support the weight, so I could remove the output gear cluster as well. I checked the locating pins were secure in the cases, and made sure I'd retrieved both locating C-rings. Then I took a good hold of the crankshaft and lifted it free from the journals. I used a rag to get a good grip, and then I removed the end cap seal. There were 2 O-rings to remove here. 1 and 2. I spanned the bottom case round to get good access to the bolts on the retainer for the selector drum and fork shafts. Before I removed the forks, I gave them a clean with brake cleaner and marked them up left, centre and right so I could make sure they go back in the right place. I gently withdrew the shafts, keeping a hold of the forks and refitting them afterwards. I removed the tensioning spring arm and roller, and with that off, I gave the drum a spin to check the bearing. All good? Well, that's almost everything out of this case. The last things to do is to take off that yucky oil pressure switch from the outside and the 2 pressure release valves from the inside. Moving back to the upper case, I removed the bolt securing the oil spray bar for the gearbox and took that out. Then I removed the bolt for the alternator shaft that holds the coupling in, then I could take that out. The shaft itself is held in by a retaining plate, held in by 2 bolts. With those removed, I could push through from the other side and slide the shaft out, being careful to retrieve the starter clutch and spacer from the inside. Well, this is very clever. So after some tidying up, I now have both the cases stripped and boxed up ready for cleaning and inspecting. So now I'm going to change the degreaser in my parts cleaner. I've picked up one of those handy brush hose things so I can scrub at the same time. Oh well, I'll need something to do while I wait for the cases to be vapor blasted. Well, thanks for joining me on my first time splitting crankcases. I hope you found it insightful. Remember, if you do want to support the channel, you can press the join button and become a workshop supporter. It's a couple of pounds a month, and if it's worth it to you, it'd be really appreciated. Anyway, see you next time.